Hello, everyone. I'm the Reverend Tom Muller, Senior Editor of Our Daily Bread at spiritualquesters.org, sermons and meditations from the Swedenborgian Church. I am here with the Reverend Dr. Jim Lawrence. Jim has agreed to kind of hang out and chat today a little bit. Jim's actually worn many hats in the Swedenborgian movement. Jim was a dean of the Center for Swedenborgian Studies, part of the doctoral faculty at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Jim has served on the board of the Swedenborg Foundation. Jim has been a pastoral minister in the Swedenborgian Church, and most recently, Jim has been elected to be the president of the Swedenborgian Church of North America. So we're just going to chat a little bit about Jim and his kind of vision, what his journey's been like, and a little bit about what the Swedenborgian Church is, in case you're new to that whole realm. So, Jim, thank you so much for being here. It's awesome to have you, as always. And Jim, if you want to just kind of perhaps start by giving us a little bit of an insight into your own journey within the Swedenborgian movement, how you came to it, and what you've been up to for the past few decades.
Well, thanks, Tom, for having me on, and it's wonderful to be here. It's always great to be in these kinds of conversations. It's a space I chose a long time ago to be able to talk about these questions of meaning and purpose in a framework that makes a lot of sense to me, and so this is the best of life in my mind. So I grew up in a every Sunday go to church family in a liberal mainline denomination, and it was a good upbringing in church. It was a loving kind of friendly church that was not doctrinally severe. It supported diversity of thought, and but I went through the what I call the obligatory atheist sojourn that actually started in high school before I even went to college, and and so I had a couple of years where I still cared about all the big questions of meaning and purpose, and my college studies were all about developmental economics for the third and fourth world. I was just shocked as a young adult at the suffering in the world, and how many how many problems seem to exist. And like so many generations before, the idealism of young adulthood is like we can do better, right? And so I was sort of diving into all of that, and I still cared about the big questions that religion would speak to, and Christianity in particular. And I enjoyed debating with Christians on college campus in a friendly way. But I hit a space where Swedenborg became kind of crucial for me while I was in college, uh, because as I ventured forward with this kind of twin uh, intellectual decision that there was no real purpose in life. There were that all the religious and uh, constructs of larger meaning, God being present with everything, that did not stand up in my mind logically anymore. But the ethics and the value of living life was emotionally strong, and of course the passion, the pain of being a privileged man from a privileged background, striving to make a difference for very underprivileged parts of the planet, led to this interesting kind of um, contradiction, which was, why would I care so much if nothing matters? Right? So why am I so emotionally distraught all the time when it's all very ephemeral and nothing persists? So it was an existential crisis for me, and it became rather pitched. And at a certain point, I I had I had some experiences in my while I was reading, and thoughts would come into my head around that that maybe some of the bigger religion questions were still relevant, and that there was still something to explore there. And it opened up a door for me in a very significant way. It was emotionally powerful to sort of open the questions again around maybe there is a bigger reality picture here that helps give meaning and support for all these existential challenges of just surviving down here on good old planet Earth. And so I began going to some different kinds of discussion groups, and I began going to different parts of bookstores. Right? I kind of had to back over into religion and philosophy a little bit, and I found the book that was just that was had only been out for a couple of years, called Life After Life by Raymond Moody, a psychiatrist who did the first qualitative study on people who claim to have experienced he coined the phrase near death experiences. And that book ended up being kind of a game changer for me, because I was fascinated by the case studies that were discussed. This was handled by a medical world person who had many subjects that were obviously significant folks who had experiences that they were having a hard time understanding how they could have those experiences. And it was a compelling book for me. And then at the end, he has this little section on 4 parallels in world literature that support the findings that were coming through the qualitative human subject studies that were represented in near-death experience research. And the one was St. Paul with his 3 levels of heaven. Another was the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Another one was Plato with his kind of structures of dimensions of being. This one being kind of the base to when one ascends back up. And then the 4th one was Emanuel Swedenborg. And I remember I still have a kinetic emotional memory of what it was like to see that name on the page. It was a very strange name. It went halfway across the page, and I just thought, what the heck is this? And I probably read the paragraphs, but the name struck me. Within a week, I was back in one of those bookstores, going over to the biography section, and then I saw this biography that was the spine vertical. I had to kind of turn my head. It was this big block letter, Swedenborg, and I pulled that book off, and it was a biography by a British artist who had become part of the Swedenborgian movement in England, early 20th century, George Trowbridge, called Swedenborg: Life and Teaching. And I didn't go to bed that night. It was such an absorbing read. And in a sense, that started a journey that led to me realizing that there was so much to discover in this thought world, that I began checking out all the books at the University of Texas at Austin Library by Swedenborg, but they were way up on like the 14th floor in the tower, and all these shelves where nobody ever checks out the books anymore. That's all the old stuff up there. And I found all these 19th century editions of Swedenborg's writings, most of which had never been checked out since before I was born, and stacked up my student desk area with that and began diving in. And it's just led to really a lifetime journey. So I did hear these strange words on the phone one time. Tom mentioned the Swedenborg Foundation, which is the largest American publisher of Swedenborg's writings, been around since 1849. And I began that was the publisher of these ancient books that I had on my desk, and I began calling them when their officers were in New York City and talking to the executive director. And once upon a time, in one of those conversations, his name was Darrell Rule, who was an actor and was very involved in getting Lillian Gish and Eddie Arnold to be in some of the early Swedenborg Foundation films. He was a fun person to talk with. And at one point he said, you know, these questions you're asking, I think it's time you maybe talk to one of the ministers. And I remember sitting there on my living room divan in Austin going, ministers? What do you mean? And he goes, well, you know, there are these churches. Are you telling me there's an entire organizational movement based on these books? And he says, yeah, you know. And so, um, and so from the very beginning, those conversations were extremely rich. And I began being in the network of the Swedenborgian movement from that point forward. And it led to finally deciding to train for being one of those ministers, right? And doing theological education at the graduate school level, and finding a movement that was still small in the world, and uh, and I needed help, right? And so I answered the call. You know, it's like it felt good that there was a use to be served, and it, even though it seemed a little precarious as a kind of an occupational path to pursue. I was still young and still in the first half of my 20s, and you know, throw yourself into adventures. So it's been now it's been nearly 4 decades since I decided to get into my Volkswagen Super Beetle and drive to Boston to meet actual people, uh, and uh, and it's been a journey of having conversations just like this one that um, have never abated in being nourishing for me. So I hung around, and I'm glad I did.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jim. You mentioned, of course, the Swedenborgian Church and the Swedenborg Foundation. I'm wondering, would you be willing to, for those viewers that may not be familiar with the Swedenborgian Church of North America, give kind of folks a little bit of um, an impression of what that organization is, what a little bit of its history is. And I think it's important to also note the structure a little bit of that organization. Jim is the president of the General Convention of the New Jerusalem, which is a democratically run organization. So, Jim, if you would be so kind as to maybe give us your take on a little bit of what is the Swedenborgian Church.
Yeah, well, and so Swedenborg lived and died as a Swedish Lutheran, himself very connected in church world through his family. His father was a fairly significant bishop that you can read about in Wikipedia, a very big personality, and his brother-in-law, with whom he lived for 6 years while he was in college, with his oldest sister, ultimately became Archbishop of the Swedish Lutheran Church. And so Swedenborg was immersed in the church world, but he himself uh, would resisted his father's attempt for him to go into the ministry. He had passions for what we today call the natural sciences, and so he has his own kind of biography. But he lived and died a Swedish Lutheran. He had a vision for reforming organized religion. Ultimately, he had a significant critique. Um, he had serious concerns around some of the journey of organized Christianity as he knew it and as he saw it, but he did not ever call for an organizational new movement. He made no attempt to start one himself. He talked about a new church, but he didn't discuss it in terms of a split away movement. It can be debated about what, or even explored and discussed, what is the new church, and we all talk about that still today. But 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 it took a while before people who were attracted to his writings, which were quite revolutionary and picked up significant readers, even in his own lifetime, that the initial impression was that they could renovate the existing churches. And so in the very beginning, as they began to gather, just even within a few years after his death in 1772, by the early 1780s, there's beginning to be an organized movement of readers, and they stayed connected to their home traditions. There were Methodists, there were Anglicans, there were Presbyterians, and but it did not take long before, I mean, literally less than a decade before a number of them came to the conclusion that it was not going to be possible to really develop the Swedenborgian vision of spirituality and the kind of functionality of how a spiritual religious movement would unfold in their older denominations and their older traditions. And so there was a schism. There were several schisms. There was a breakaway movement in England. That's not the denomination we have over here in the United States. Interestingly, the all when the you know the when all of the immigrations from Europe happened to the New World, mostly they were religious dissenters who had not found favor, who were persecuted, and who did not have the same rights as the principal religions in Europe. And so you get this movement happening in the United States. And Swedenborg's books were actually on the shores of the colonies of America by 1784. There was actually already books that came off of a ship in Philadelphia's harbor. So the books were here, but interestingly, the major breakaway denominations that came to America, the colonies, were the dissenting traditions that had already been in existence for quite a while. So the American movements of all of those, the Baptists, all of the Calvinist branches, the Congregationalists, Quakers, they all had a stream from Europe. But the Swedenborgian movement in England was not significant enough in size for there to be any migration across the ocean at all that we can discover in history. So what happened with the Swedenborgian movement in the United States that becomes the Swedenborgian Church of North America was entirely homegrown out of new readers who then went through the exact same process that had happened in England, that they would be able to kind of carry the richness of this spiritual treasure of Swedenborg's writings into the discourse of their own denominations. But that did not pan out any better in the American colonies than it did in England. And so those reading groups who did not feel that they were getting any traction inside their existing denomination began solidifying their gatherings to be more worshipful, in addition to having discussions. And those were cells that were meeting in coffee houses and living rooms, and those grew into increasingly sizable gatherings that then finally met together in a fateful year, 1817, to have a convention where there was about 45 of these groups meeting together, and that began the denomination of the Swedenborgian Church of North America. So let's see, what else did you want me to talk about there, Tom?
What about some of the organization today? What does it look like? What are some of the core practices or tenets? Kind of how does the organization work?
Yeah, so the a fascinating dimension that continues the theme of religious freedom in the New World is pivotal to the political forms of religion that began to emerge and characterize what becomes America. And this is a democratized movement around religion that was in significant contradistinction compared to religion in Europe. And there was such a democratized approach to religion in the New World that often there was often even an anti-clerical movement that maybe even ministers or trained leaders was a bad idea because those people can get out of hand with their sense of authority, right? Although the need to have an educated movement won out in a large measure. And so the first mostly century in the colonies were primarily democratized, what are called congregational polity movements, where there's no hierarchy, there's no power above a local group telling the group what to do, what to believe, how to handle their ministry operation. And that continues to be the most dominant form of religion in the United States. And the more hierarchical denominations ultimately do have major immigrations to the United States, but they come much later in American history. So we have the complexity today in our American culture with how religion is organized, very horizontal, democratic, much more vertical with what are called episcopal forms of government that have bishops or heads of state, autocephalous, a head of body, and they all kind of have a life here in the United States. But the Swedenborgian Church in North America became congregational in polity and remains congregational today. So we're a movement that has elections for every office that has any power at all, that have term limits on offices, that has a lot of structures built in for the big body of folks in the fellowship and in the movement to be self-governing, and that you can overturn a an episode in governance that you don't like fairly quickly because of the way new elections come around pretty fast. So we've been a congregational movement that that allows for tremendous diversity of expression from region to region, from ministry to ministry. And in most parts of the life of the denomination, and especially in the last 30 years, there's been an encouragement for creativity at the local level. So we have new start ministries that do very different things. Like in the Los Angeles area, we have a new start ministry called the Garden Church, which was a vision of a new graduate out of the theological training program who wanted to have the space of gathering to be in outside in public spaces to do good things in society. When originally the vision was to move in discussions with the local governments to constantly reclaim underused or misused or vacant lands, turn them into garden spaces, and then move on to the next one, right? So that you have this kind of work, pray, and praise kind of way of making the world better. But that became challenging to pull off with how complicated and elongated having conversations with government entities around having control over land turned out to be. but staying with the vision of that kind of space, they have taken over a space, and from the beginning have created a garden that is part of the weekly work of the congregation, out of which comes community, the ability to feed people, to allow for people to just be walking by, to be part of the movement. And it's a very popular ministry, and is the kind of free space for creativity that I think characterizes the atmosphere of our denomination. We had another new start that happened in the Southwest Desert, where the minister had this idea of creating a new house church for artists primarily, and ultimately they took over a coffee shop and have a space for a very wide ranging community where many people are participatory in even putting together the meaning and structure part of their worship services. And as well, we have very traditional churches. For reasons that are a little hard to peg down thoroughly, it's been often asked, why does such a small movement like the Swedenborgian Church of North America have so many famous pieces of architecture for their sacred spaces? Recently, Fodor, the travel manual Fodor's, put out a list of the 20 most interesting houses of worship to visit if you're visiting America in the entire country. 2 of those 20 are Swedenborgian, and recently there was an article. There was an architect scholar who was naming the single most interesting piece of architecture in all 50 states. And for California, Wayfarer's Chapel was the choice. And so there's these very lovely churches too, traditional, like the architecture can be very avant-garde as it is with some of the places, but also there's terrific kind of neo-Gothic and Renaissance style churches too. So there's a diversity around formality and very informal ways that people gather today. I would say to speak about the thought life a little bit.
Mhm.
Swedenborg has an interesting reception history in Western thought. There's a tremendous list of artists, poets, even musicians, sort of novelists who point to Swedenborg as one of their inspiration points. We call it the famous names list. And at the same time, Swedenborg's critique of Christianity was so ferocious that that it never really had much traction inside the traditional major branches of Christianity, because Swedenborg was not a person who ever twisted arms. He did not attend gatherings. He did not try to have a person-to-person diplomacy around his kind of visionary ideas of revolutionizing what spiritual formation was all about, how one would go about relating to the inner life and the outer life for all of that. He basically wrote books and died. And so that's not an effective way to actually make political progress inside organized traditions to change their ways. So it's interesting to walk through, say, the theological libraries of America and go through a lot of the classical topical areas, biblical studies, where Swedenborg had an enormous amount of work on how to read sacred text, having a spiritualized, symbolic view of the text, or theology, where he had a systematic reformation of Reformation thought itself, as well as also the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic structures. You can go into these topics in libraries and pull book after book off the shelf, look at the index to see if Swedenborg is mentioned there, and 95% of the time he's not. However, if you go into literary studies, art and religion history, Swedenborg is a common reference. So I was talking with a scholar once at Florida State University, who was there was a religious studies department and then the literature department, and Swedenborg's name was coming up with uh, with a couple of people there, and the comment was made, it's interesting that in the religious studies department, almost nobody knows anything about Swedenborg. In the literature department, everybody knows about Swedenborg. So I speak about that framework to set up why I feel the Swedenborgian movement is still today a highly distinctive way of exploring the depths of Christianity in particular, but he was also very pluralist, and it reaches into these kind of deeper dimensions of all meaning and purpose quests. And so even though it's easy to be Swedenborgian in perspective and participate in other traditions, it's easy to find community of thought and to and have a rich sort of way of hearing what others have to say and making contributions. It's still such a distinctive style of spirituality that it makes perfect sense to me that there's also a uniqueness around the way the Swedenborgian movement operates in the world. So significantly, the thought life that I think stands out is the insistence of Swedenborg on how you live your life is actually your theology. So he has lots to say about how understanding reality structures are important for the inner psyche to understand the parameters of the reality system in which they live. But at the same time, there's been too much of a problem in the history of religion of this idea of having the ideas right as the core of religion. The core of religion is ethical love and being able to, in a healthy way, live a life with increasingly more effective, deeper connectivity to the living systems of life. And that is the church. That's what he calls the universal church. That's really the true church. And so what's distinctive in Swedenborgian spirituality is a fairly constant conversation about the inner life and the practices of understanding how daily living is a functional sort of approach to living love that does have idea structures associated with it, but it's more based on practice. Another big dimension that's still very important to me personally is this whole business of near-death experiences. The very topic that got me involved. It's, as I've now lived through the decades, I notice that this is a dimension of Swedenborgian thought that is still about in the same place that it was decades ago. There's a tremendous overlap and fusion than possible with the way social ethics and interpersonal ethics can be understood with other traditions. But there's a dominant theme in American culture and in European culture that has increasingly solidified around a skepticism of a transcendental universe. So as there's been the advance of a scientific critique of religion and philosophy, and a critique around the idea that there is anything more than the physical universe. Um, there has been no real growth around the realm of thought that continues to unfold in significant pockets as the research has continued to amass into tens of thousands of testimonies in near-death studies. I don't know. I think it's important. It's like I'm surprised in conversations to find so many of dialogue partners and interlocutors who do not feel that that is an important question, that this is perhaps this nothing more is needed than this life. I'm here to have this life. Existential reality is a world in which I find myself, and I don't need anything more. And for me, philosophically, I uh, I I I still have a hard time accepting that as a desirable outcome for why I'm here. So, for me, it kind of comes down to, what? Oh, being, non-being, it's all the same. I don't think so. I don't think it's all the same. And for me, the long game that Swedenborg talked about, the reason why Swedenborg is so significant in Raymond Moody's book is that he wrote a work that is his bestseller, that that has sold more copies than all of his other titles put together. It's called Heaven and Hell: From Things Heard and Seen, and it's his own sort of qualitative research testimony about what he experienced in the cosmos. And so he was a person who not only believed that there were multiple dimensions to being, but that he had been somehow given the capacity to experience a lot more of multidimensionality, and spent a lot of time experiencing other dimensions. And the beauty, the the power of that kind of worldview changes the significance for me of everything I do or think. The significance has a longer reach and gives me uh, a heightened sense of importance of interrogating my own ethics, interrogating the integrity of the path, because it's going to keep going. And the beauty of being uh, the beauty of becoming a truly loving person cannot be matched by anything else. So it's a vision of experience that is rarely achieved in the world I see. And
Mhm.
so I'm still a big fan of this dimension of discourse that has always been intrinsic to Swedenborgian thought,
Yeah.
and would like to be continue to be doing more supportive ways of shaping journeys of discovery around that.
Speaking of which, speaking of the current life of the church, I mentioned that, or you mentioned the diversity that exists within the movement, which is something that always attracted me to it, and what made me feel comfortable in it. You mentioned the many different backgrounds that people have, and There's the near-death studies aspect that's drawn in art and culture, folks in the Western esoteric tradition, folks that are interested in mysticism, people that are interested in pluralism, all of these different things, people coming together and having a space where there is rich and mostly harmonious discourse and community has been really great for me. Being able to be a minister, in fact, and not having a dogmatic framework that I have to abide by, and yet this rich foundational text and so forth. So thank you for pointing out the kind of diversity and democratic nature that exists in that tradition. I think that's something that a lot of folks are drawn to. And speaking of, you mentioned supporting this movement. And you also mentioned, of course, the sort of polity of the movement. We don't have a pope or a bishop or cardinals, and yet the president of the denomination does have an important voice and facilitates a lot of great discussion and so forth, and has a way of realizing or at least attempting to realize it, part of their vision for the denomination. So I'm wondering what is it that you come into this office with? What are some of your passions, some of your interests, perhaps some of your vision for how you envision our movement and our denomination moving further into the information age, in these very interesting and kind of revolutionary times these days. So I'd love to just hear a brief kind of a little brief summary of what do you feel passionate about as you enter this office.
I think I have two areas that are front and center for me. One is exploring the new world of virtual more effectively.
Mhm.
So the speaking earlier in this conversation about coming to the new world, um, and there was a new world for Europeans. Of course, there was the old world for the indigenous people. So we got the baggage there of our unfortunate history of kind of taking over a land that already had a lot of folks in it. But in that conversation of approaching a new world, I think the new world today is the virtual world. It collapses geographies. And that the new world is instantaneous space around community for people of a like mind and heart who feel the common cause to get together. So we've had this now 200-year plus journey as the Swedenborgian Church in North America. That has always been, until very recently, um, bricks and mortar spaces, oftentimes beautifully done, who get mentioned in articles, right? But that the new way of gathering is something um, to cultivate carefully. So I still believe in taking care of all the bricks and mortar spaces. It's a way of gathering that is hard to beat. The being in person is rich. You can't really replace that level of community. And we have beautiful kind of spaces, and we have committed groups. And so I think part of any presidential uh, commitment to being a good steward of what we have is to do everything possible to help all of our groups continue to have their way of talking to themselves and talking to the world. But on top of that, there has not been nearly enough done around virtual gatherings. So we're starting some new gatherings. The way that community happens is around like-minded interests, like loves that are shared, and there's clearly a strong center of gravity for something like Swedenborgian spirituality. So that's a major emphasis for me, is to build that new world. And the other one is to continue to support new talents who want to work in this world. You know, you know, it's a pretty cool life, in my opinion. And we need more people who would find it rewarding to have a way of working in the world where they are ministers, or they are pastors, or they are specialists, and are supported institutionally in holding these kind of gatherings together, so that the world can grow, in which Swedenborgian spirituality is experienced and developed to help create new horizons. That's what a healthy movement is always doing. And I feel that we're in a place to try to offer new ways of doing that kind of work, um, compared to the older formats that we have. And so I would like to encourage um, people who are interested in this kind of work to explore us, to see what might be possible. It's hard to, if you have a love for spiritual philosophy, it's it's a wonderful kind of way to work in the world, to have the responsibility to do it well, to do all of the kind of housekeeping, taking care of basic business in order for those gatherings to be supported. It's a way of life, and it's a vocational path. So I'm very interested in reaching out to new talent and inviting them to explore ways of being in the world that probably doesn't have a close analog anyplace else.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. And speaking of exploring the Swedenborgian tradition, certainly invite you to read some Swedenborg. It's pretty easy to find these days. You can go to swedenborg.org if you want to find out more about our denomination, the Swedenborgian Church of North America. You can go to spiritualquesters.org, which is the home of this program. And you can go to swedenborg.com, which is the Swedenborg Foundation, where you can find lots of works by Swedenborg, of course, including free editions of his work, and a lot of other really good stuff that Swedenborgians have written, and folks about Swedenborg and so forth. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for joining us today. It's always good to hear your voice and to hear your thought, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and I'm sure it's not going to be the last time. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Jim.